Today, in America, by some measures, 20% of all listed companies in America can be classified as zombie companies. So, is this capitalism again? What's the consequence of this?
Would you like to maybe spend a little time on this whole concept of zombieism and where will it go? And add to that the fact that if the dollar is no longer going to be, in a few years from now, the currency of choice, like you have traced, all over Europe you had some 5 or 6 reserve currencies come up over the past few centuries. What happens? All these deadly mix with the currency getting weaker.
You spoke about zombies, and what exactly do I mean by zombies? It's a great sort of term out here. So it became very popular in America, in Japan in fact. It was coined in America by some economists in the late 1980s. In the 1990s, the concept of zombies became very popular in Japan. These were companies, when the Japanese economy was declining rapidly and going bust, these are companies that did not even earn enough interest or enough profits to cover their interest payments for 3 years in a row. They were dubbed as zombie companies. The American media at that point in time, and I trace this in the book as well, would sort of, show the fact that this is happening in Japan, and they would mock it, that this is America, we don't do this zombification of capitalism, as they put it. So at that point in time, the number of zombie companies in America was 2% of the total. Today, in America, by some measures, 20% of all listed companies in America can be classified as zombie companies. So is this capitalism again? What's the consequence of this? If you keep alive so much deadwood in the system, it's very difficult then for new entrants to come in. And that's what's happened in America, that at the bottom you got this zombification, at the top you got these oligopolies, and that's happened because of another government intervention that I trace in the book, where you have too much regulation. And I think this is a very important point which in India also we need to understand. Regulation, when you do, is by definition helps the incumbent and helps big businesses. Why? Because big businesses can afford to have lawyers and all other legal people around to deal with the regulatory environment, because the cost of complying has gone up 10 times literally over the last 20 years. And secondly, when you have regulations, it is the big businesses that are able to lobby and have regulations written in their favor. So what I've shown in the book is that some of these perverse outcomes we've seen of capitalism in the West here today, of too many oligopolies, because capitalism should be against oligopolies. Because capitalism is what? That if somebody makes too many profits, some new entrants are supposed to come and take those profits away when you have a freedom of entry. But if you have too many oligopolies, shows something is wrong with capitalism. So these are all symptoms to me of what went wrong with capitalism. And I argue that how the role of government has played in terms of creating these symptoms, whether it's oligopolies, and what are the government policies? Too much regulation, bailing out companies, which leads to also zombification, the poison of low interest rates. These are some of the policies which have led to these perverse outcomes, and why the average person in the West in particular, is feeling so miffed by the system, and you have a great anti-establishment feeling.
Just another point that related. If the dollar loses its prominence, what happens to what has happened, what the situation in the US with the deficits and the zombies and so on?
So this is a very long process, as I sort of argue in the book, that if you look at the history of the world, every 100 years or so, there has been a new reserve currency. What really is a reserve currency? A reserve currency is a currency which is commonly used by everyone for using their transactions, and the country which has that reserve currency has one big benefit, that other countries are forced to hold that currency. So they're able to fund their deficit more, and they have an advantage in general by having a reserve currency, right? So for the last 600 years or so, as I trace in the book's history, that every 100 years there's been a new reserve currency. It's never been permanent. So before the dollar was the world's reserve currency, for 100 years before, it used to be sterling. Before that, the French franc, before that, the Spanish currency, before that, the Portuguese, and before that, the Dutch. That's the history. And every 100 years. Every time too much debt, in the end, sunk those reserve currencies because the world lost confidence in holding that. That's what happened to the UK also after the two wars they fought and the empire was overstretched. That's what happened to UK in terms of it, and the dollar took over. The good thing about the dollar today, the great benefit it's had as to why this reign seems to be lasting longer, is that there is no competitor in sight. China could have been the obvious competitor, because but the great irony here is that even though the China's size in the economy global economy has increased dramatically over the last 30 to 40 years, because it is a largely closed capital account and people don't trust a currency still backed by a communist party in terms of that. So the Chinese currency has not been able to gain much share out there. Similarly, Europe could have been a contender. At one point in time, the euro was considered like a great currency. But even there, Europe's been, as I argue in the book, that capitalism is in worse shape in Europe, right? So therefore, Europe has also not emerged as a contender. This has given the dollar a much longer leash. But we're seeing signs of cracks emerge. How is this happening? Two things are going on. If you look at the central bank reserves of the world, there are two trends which are playing out. One, that they're buying a lot of gold. So now the share of dollars in their foreign exchange reserves is coming down, and they're buying lots of gold. That's a very new development because they haven't bought gold in such size in a long period of time. The second thing is they're buying smaller currencies, Swiss, Australian, some of these, they're buying that. So it's a death by 1,000 cuts. It's a very slow process that's likely to play itself out. But if the US continues to behave this way, and I've said so in the past, the single biggest mistake that America made, according to me in history, and these things take time to do, was the way it imposed financial sanctions on Russia. Because the dollar is still the world's reserve currency. But the way it imposed sanctions on Russia for the first time, where it threw Russia off the entire financial system and said, off you go in terms of that, and they seized their foreign exchange reserves, which were lying in foreign accounts, that sent a real chill down many central banks around the world, many governments around the world, who said, if this can happen to Russia, this can happen to us one day. And that is if you look at the point, the acceleration in central banks buying gold, central banks buying Swiss francs, it began from March of 2022 when this action was taken. So these are all things which take a long period of time. We're talking about 100-year history spans here. But I'd say the process of chipping away, and that has begun. And one of the key things I think, in fact, for now, which will also help the rise of the rest, is that a strong dollar tends to help America, but a weaker dollar in terms of helps more capital move to emerging markets. So I fundamentally believe that emerging markets are going to benefit from a weaker dollar over the next 5 to 10 years. And one of the more controversial, provocative sort of things that I said, someone asked me this question the other day, that where do you think the rupee is headed? I said rupee is 84 today. I'm willing to bet that the next move in the rupee is towards 80, not 90.